Hi everybody, welcome to today's Quick Learn series. We're going to be covering Photoshop basics, particularly for web. My name is Susie Johannes, and with me I have Michelle Brewer. Michelle's going to help monitor the chat as we go through today's session. If this is your first time attending a Quick Learn, a few things. This Quick Learn series is a series we designed to be webinars that are based on a specific topic. So you might have attended them in the past. As part of today's webinar or Quick Learn, we are recording it. So you might have noticed that the recording had started. The recording will be posted on our Quick Learns webpage under the IT or technology.ku.edu site. So I'll send out the follow-up email after this is over once we have that recording up with the link directly to it in case you want to review it again or send it to a friend. As I noted today, Michelle's going to be helping with the chat. If you do have questions, we ask that you submit them through the chat, and then we can help you, or if we don't have the answer, I'll include the answer in the follow-up. If this is your first time joining a Skype for Business meeting, just a few tips. It can be helpful to maximize your window so that you can see my screen as large as possible. Everyone should be currently muted, and you can tell that because in the bottom of your screen you'll see a slash through your microphone. We ask just that you stay muted and then submit your questions through the chat. In order to see that chat, you can click on the little message icon in the bottom left. Depending on how you're joining, you may see those chat messages pop up in other ways, but that little chat icon is one of the best ways to view the ongoing chat. And then in the upper right, if you're joining through the browser version, you might want to look in the upper right. There is some different presentation options, and you can choose presentation view, which will make my screen as large as possible on your screen. So just an overview of what we're going to cover. We do have to start off with just some basics. We're going to cover Photoshop, what is it, how to get it, and just a sample workflow for when creating images by web. We'll also look at a possible naming convention to help you keep track of the different files that you'll create. Then we'll just get into some basics. So we're going to start off just by opening a file, checking the image size and resolution, editing, correcting the images using layers, changing the canvas size or resizing, cropping images for web, and then we'll look at how to export for web and the different file formats. We will cover some advanced tips and tricks. I'm going to touch a little bit on a new file format called SVG, talk about using smart objects, and also a newish feature in Photoshop called Image Generator. So hopefully if you're just starting out with Photoshop, you'll get some basics for how to get started. For those of you who are joining, who are already working with websites and web graphics, hope that you can take away maybe some shortcuts and maybe some new features. So we do have to start about, talking about what is Photoshop. It's a raster-based software, and it's best used for photos and mixed media projects. So we really use it a lot for, resizing and retouching photographs, even so much so that it's become its own verb, Photoshop it. It's really great for projects that will stay a fixed size, such as here it says, animated or static web banner ads, digital projects, web graphics. And the reason why it's good for projects that will stay fixed in size is because of how it builds graphics. So I mentioned that it's raster based, and what that is referring to is how it is actually building those graphics on the screen. And because it's raster based, what it does is it creates your shapes or your images on the screen by using individual pixels. Now the opposite of raster-based is vector-based, and on the right you see the Illustrator graphic there. In a vector-based program, it builds the graphics by mapping the paths between points. And in this way that it does this, it makes it so that you can scale it down or scale it up without losing image resolution. Because of the way Photoshop works with graphics, it's great for photographs because that's how photographs are created. However, it means that you can't enlarge graphics to beyond just incremental enlargements, or else you'll start to see that pixelation. So here, if we blew this A up maybe 2 or 3 times the size, you would start to see those individual pixels or individual squares create that pixelation or rasterization along the edges. Um, so when we work with web projects, that's why a lot of times we need to know the web sizes. The big thing with Photoshop, because you use those pixels, it's a raster-based program, you want to start with as large of an image as you can, or a good quality image. And we'll talk more about that. But before that, just how do you get Photoshop? If you're a staff member here on campus for your work machine that's managed by KU, talk to your local tech staff. We have a new agreement with Adobe where 50% of our machines can get it. And then if you're at home on your personal computer, you can purchase a year subscription of Adobe Creative Cloud for $10 on kansas.onthehub.com. I'll include those links in the follow-up as well, so you can purchase that if you haven't. Students on campus, their best option is to look for a computer lab. So we have this software in most computer labs now. They're centrally managed. And then at home for personal use, students have a discounted rate that's just through Adobe, and they can find that on the Adobe website. So I want to talk a little bit just about a sample workflow, and this is kind of ideal, an ideal case. I know a lot of times you're working for a deadline or, something like that, and you don't have a lot of time to do this. But what you'll do when you're creating images for the web in the ideal scenario is you'll first, have your original photo, which will be your high quality photo, either, directly from the camera or possibly from marketing communications or something like that. It's a good idea to just check the image size and resolution in Photoshop just to make sure you can tell how large that image is. Now, once you have that original, you'll make any corrections, retouch the image, edit the image, hopefully using layers so that you can undo anything that you don't want. And you'll save that modified version with the layers as its own file. Then from that modified version, you'll create a version for web, which is usually quite a bit smaller and doesn't have layers. You may also create a copy for print. In this case, we're not going to do that since we are going to just be working for web projects in today's session. But in the end, you should have possibly 3, possibly 4 different copies of the photo to allow yourself the flexibility to move back, if necessary, back to the modified or back to the original. And so in doing so, you'll end up with a lot of maybe more files than you're used to. It's been a while since I worked as a graphic designer. I just included an idea of how you could keep this organized. So at the top we have our basic folder with the date of the event or project. This could also be 2016 fall or something like that, the event or the project, and then possibly the name assets. Under that we have separate folders for originals, modified, print, and web. And then even if all these photos were in the same folder, you could kind of tell if they were different. Here we have our originals. These are usually either TIFF or RAW. Then when we go to modify those, we save them. Here I've included an _R for revised or retouched, either as a TIFF file or a PSD file. Those 2 file formats allow you to save all those layers that you created. If you were going to create that separate one for print, you might create a TIFF. I could also have said EPS here. There's different formats that will work for print. Usually you convert those to CMYK depending on your print project. So sometimes they'll have like an _CMYK or something like that. And then finally for web, those will be usually JPEG or PNG. There's other formats we'll talk about. It can be a nice habit to get into putting the pixel dimensions here in the title so that you can quickly see which images are which, but it does take extra time, so I understand if a lot of people don't do that. So we're going to follow these basic steps today, and we're going to start just by creating an image that will be used on a CMS slideshow. So to kind of show you what that's going to look like in the end, we just have the sample site set up, and so we have our slideshow here, and we're using these pixel dimensions 850 by 380. I'll show you where we got those as we work through this image. But so that's what we're going to be working towards, just an image without any text or anything on it, because with the slideshow we can include the text as, you know, a caption over the image. All right, so working in Photoshop, first I have some different sample files set up. In this first example, I tried to follow what I had shown you before. I have my originals folder, a modified folder, print, and web. Originals, I just put an underscore before it so that hopefully it'll appear first in the in the in the folder. So here I have my originals. Unlike what I told you, I actually pulled these from the web, so these aren't straight from the camera. I did look for the most high quality images using Google search tools, so these are a little bit larger than normal, but just for full disclosure, I'll tell you that. Okay, cool. So here we have just this sample picture. I don't know who the rightful owner of it is. In this, what we're going to do now is just do some basic correction for this photo. And what I'd like to do is just to show you how to use layers in order to make this, do your corrections, and that way you can undo what you've done. Eventually in the future, if how you've corrected the photo looks dated, you can get rid of that correction and that type of thing. So first things first, down here in the bottom right hand corner we see all of our layers, and by default this is a locked layer called background. The very first thing I like to do is make a copy of that original. So I'll right click and I'll just say duplicate layer and I'll say OK, and that will just create a copy here. So now no matter what, I can always go back to look at my original, or I can even go back to my original if needed. Now by default these layers show in the order that they appear here, and because the copy's on top I'll never see the background layer. But if I wanted to, I could just, you know, even hide that as well by clicking the eye here in the column. All right, now that I've made a copy, I can start to do some adjustments. Now it used to be more that you would do these image adjustments for as far as color correction goes by going to image adjustments. But now what I prefer to do is, instead of doing that, which will actually just adjust this layer, instead of doing that, I like to use what are called adjustment layers. And so you find those, there's a little icon that looks like a circle. Let me make this a little bit just so I can show you this, and then I'll maximize it. This icon here that looks like a half circle or something like that, I'll choose that, and then I get all those same options here. So I have options for curves, level, brightness, contrast, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to kind of do some of these things. I don't know exactly what will be best, but I'll start off just with brightness and contrast and see if I can maybe make it a little less bright so that I can start to see some of the detail in the sidewalk and that type of thing. And then maybe I will take out some of the contrast so that I can start to see more of the highlights in the windows and that type of thing. So because I created that as a layer here, I can just turn the layer off if I want to compare it with the original. The other cool thing is, because it's a layer, I can change the opacity, which will be kind of the strength of this color correction. So if I sort of like this, but not as much as it's being applied, I can adjust that layer's opacity and kind of ease back the effect that it's having on the layer below. Now if I ever want to go back and you know, change that layer, I can double click on the icon here and it will pop open this panel, and there I can, you know, maybe back off the contrast or something like that. Also in this panel is the ability to just apply this to the layer directly below. So here this could be important if we have like many layers and there's some layers that are transparent and that type of thing. So here I could just apply it to the layer below if needed. I'm going to go ahead and do that so that it just applies it to my copy layer. So that was using just brightness and contrast. There's a lot of different ways I could adjust this photo. I'm going to try this curves one out. Now curves opens this panel here where you can either change this line here to change how the colors are being treated and that type of thing. They also have some built-in kind of presets here. So just like increase contrast. You can do that. If I want to go back, I can always hit the reset button. I have to be honest, I don't really know what I'm doing a lot of times in curves. So what I rely on sometimes are these color pickers. And what this is, one is for black values, one is for white values, and one is for neutral values. So the idea here is that you can use one of these samplers and then pick out a place on your image in order to adjust the image. So here, this is going to look pretty awful, but I'm going to choose the neutral one. And, you know, in my mind, this the asphalt here on the road should be somewhat gray or neutral. So I'm just going to kind of click around there until I get to something that doesn't look way off and see if I can get something that doesn't look as yellow. Alright, so once I have it somewhat like I like, again, this is way distorted, I'm going to go ahead and apply it just to the layer below. And then what I'm going to do is just back off that opacity. So now what I have is the ability to take out some of the yellowness or some of the kind of pinkness of that photo and without, you know, going at it 100% or having to redo this over and over till I get it perfect. The other cool thing about using layers in this way is that you can toggle back and forth. And a great tip or trick here is if you use the Alt key, or on Mac it'll be Option, you can click just on one of the eyes on the Layers panel, and that will isolate just that layer. So here we can toggle back and forth from the original, and now look at the one that we created. I don't know. I don't actually know if mine's any better than the original, but maybe we'll get there. I can see a little bit more detail, so maybe that's what I want. Now with these layers, there's a lot of different options here. What I prefer to do is try to do as much correction as possible through the layers, but it's not always possible to just use the layers. So, you know, I'm going to go ahead and click on my copy here and make some more adjustments. These adjustments I make now, they won't actually be things that I can undo for this layer, but I could always go back to the original using this, or I could go back to my original file. So the first thing is another adjustment. Again, I have to select that layer with the photograph. If I go to Image Adjustments, this is one that Susan, one of our web designers here, showed me. Under Adjustments, we have this Shadows and Highlights. What's kind of cool about this is that it's kind of a really modern, it makes your photo look more modern. So here you have the ability to control shadows and highlights. And what the shadows will do is really allow you to pull more detail out of that photo. It almost starts to look like, I think they're called HDR, high def photos, even though this is just some random photo I found on the web. Highlights, same thing, you can pull out more detail from the highlights. In this case, I don't want to see any more detail of the road or anything like that. So that one I found under Image Adjustments and Highlights, and it allowed me to pull out more of that detail there in the windows and things like that. Another tool I'll sometimes use is the crop tool. Now in this case, I'm going to use the crop tool to straighten this image. So for me, looking at this image, it looks like a little bit downhill, or a little bit tilted the way that this picture is showing. And so there is a tool called like the ruler tool that you can find. It's under the eyedropper tool. But using the crop tool, you can do the same thing. And let me just clear this. So once you click on the crop tool, there's an area in the top bar called straighten, and there you can select a ruler tool. When you have the ruler tool on your mouse, you can then drag a line, and you're trying to find a line that should be either horizontal or perpendicular. So either, some 90-degree angle. So I'll just drag that across there, and when I let up, what it does is two things. It automatically rotates the image so that that line that I drew is now perfectly horizontal. And then, because when we rotate the picture, we have a little white space created where there's no information, it creates a crop box for me that will crop out everything I need in order to just have the image. So whenever you're cropping and you see these handles like this, you have two options. One, you can hit the Enter key on the keyboard to accept the crop, or there's a check mark up here. To undo, you can hit the Escape key, or you can go to Reset or just Undo. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Enter. That's just going to save our image there. And like I mentioned, because I've been working with layers for the most part and I made that copy, I can now, using that Alt click, toggle back and forth. So there's my original and then there's my new photo. And so again, the cool thing about this is that, in 5 years, this kind of photo treatment might start to look really dated. I can always come back to the original and just delete these layers, or delete, just this layer that has the effect or the adjustment on it, and kind of go back to how it used to look without having to reinvent everything. So before we move on, I'd like to just pause for some questions here. So if you do have any questions, if you will submit them through the chat over anything that we covered so far with the adjustment and that type of thing, the adjustment layers or the tools that we used. Okay, well, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll keep moving. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, the ruler tool application again. I can definitely do that. Let me just step back. Okay. And the way that I'm going to do this to step back, I came up here to the history panel, and that allows me to step back, and I could go forward too if I wanted to, incremental steps. You may know this from working with Photoshop. You can do a Control-Z once to undo the last step, but beyond that, you have to do an Alt-Control-Z to keep moving back steps. The other option you have is, like I did, go to the history panel and click back to the point where you want to start. So in order to kind of straighten and crop this in one go, I have to click on the crop tool here in the tools panel. And then up here in the toolbar, I need to click on this ruler by straighten. Once I have that, the ruler icon is on my mouse. And then I need to just find any line that's either horizontal or vertical. So here in this case, I can even use this flagpole. And I just click and drag a line that appears to be straight on like one edge of that pole. When I release from that, and this did it just a little bit lesser, that looks like, it's going to straighten the whole image, and it's also going to do this second thing and put this crop box around the image so that I can crop out the areas of the photo now that don't have any information because we rotated it. So here, just to accept this, I could hit enter. If I didn't like it, I could hit escape, or up at the top there was like a cancel or reset option. Um, so in order to, once I'm done modifying this, what I'm going to do first is, and actually I should have done this to start with, is look at the image size. So here, to find that image size, I come up here to image and image size. And here's where I can see the overall size of this image. Now, the important things to pay attention to here, this is showing us our overall resolution. Resolution is a little bit difficult to explain. I have a slide here that I'll pull up. The big thing about resolution is that it is a ratio. And so ideally, when you're resizing images, the higher the resolution here, so if I change this resolution to be 300, which is the standard for print, the smaller my photo is going to be. Now, it is possible when you go to image size and you resize your image this way, if this box resample is chosen, you can choose any dimension for your resolution, and it will forcibly change on screen, in the box what the resolution is. However, it's not truly changing the resolution, and this really is mostly for enlarging. So basically, the best advice I have to give you is to try never to resample, and instead have that box closed, and that way when you are entering a new resolution, it'll tell you, for example here with print resolution, this is the largest that this image can appear on my page. Any larger than that, I'll start to lose the image quality, and it will start to become pixelated or rasterized. And sorry about for those of you who are, I guess you can't hear me anyway, so. um, All right, so that's a little bit on resolution. I'm actually going to change this to my print resolution so that it's higher resolution and click OK. And so this is where I would save this in my modified folder. So here I'd say File, Save As. I would look for my modified folder, and then I would give it a name. Like in my example, I said to use the date of the event, or the whatever it is. I have quite a few of these, so I'm just going to try to do something that's unique. And then I like to do an R afterwards, just that this has been revised. The important thing here, save it as either a Photoshop file with layers, or you can save it as a TIFF file, again with layers. That way you can always go back and work from that modified without having to redo a lot of your work that you've already done. So I'll go ahead and say save, OK. It's going to say increasing layers will increase file size. That's fine. And click OK. All right. So let's see where we are. So I should have done that checking image size first, just so I could see what I was working with to begin with. I did it at the end. It worked out OK. But like I mentioned, basic steps, check the image size, duplicate your original layer, make those color corrections through layers when possible, make any final adjustments that you need to, and then save as a PSD or TIFF file with layers. Now, with that resolution, I'll send out these slides as a follow-up as well as a flyer that we created. I changed that resolution to 300 pixels per inch, which is a standard for print production. When we go to create our web version, it can be quite a bit smaller than that. So basic screen resolution is somewhere around 72 pixels per inch. When we start to get into other screen types for digital, it can be higher, but for basic websites and things like that, it's still around 72 pixels per inch. If you were to take pictures or scan pictures that were going to be enlarged, that's probably the point where you'd want to scan in or take things that are 300 or higher pixels per inch so that you could enlarge them. And just like it's showing here, the higher resolution you have, the more pixels, the more information you have in that picture, and so the cleaner the lines will appear when you have those hard lines or the shifts in color. Okay, so we're going to move forward and we're going to create our image for the web. Now, in order to create our image for the web, we need to have the right size of image. So how do you find out what size your image should be? There's a couple options you have here. First, you could find an image on the server that will work, that has worked in the past. So in this example for your slideshow, if you go into one of your web folders and you see these sliders, you can click on the photo, and at the bottom of the panel, if you're on a PC, you should see the dimensions. If not, you can always right click, or on a Mac, a two-finger click, and then you can either say properties, or on a Mac, it's like get info, and you'll be able to view the dimensions that way. So that's one way. Another way is, using file browsers. You can right click on images and you can say inspect element. I'm not going to rely on that option for this point. I think it can be a little bit confusing, especially with slideshows, because the slideshow images are always moving and things like that. So I'm going to skip over that. The next option here is to log into the CMS and look in the file browser. So ideally what you would end up doing, and I've logged in here to our, I did log in here to our, so ideally what you would end up doing is you would find like a slideshow image that worked well. Here I just went ahead and put the pixel dimensions in the caption, but most likely you would never do that. I might say, I can come up here to find content. In this case, I can see those slides that are public, and I can see, click on them. When I'm here, I can even click on New Draft and find exactly what file that is. So once I know what file it is, I can go into the file browser here on the site and I can just view the dimensions. So the reason I went through all this is because I know for a fact on this site we have different dimensions of slides, just because we use it for training and things like that. So here, if I go to file browser now, usually this file browser is specific to this site, even though the folders usually look the same from site to site. I can click on the slideshow folder under the images folder, and I should be able to find, here's that image I used, and I can see here the width and the height is 850 by 380. Now, the last option I have here is to check the CMS site, and I have links here. I'll also send out in the follow-up. The thing about your image sizes, we have kind of image size styles here that you can use. My image size was different than this, and the thing about it is that the most important thing is, if you already have slideshow images up, is just to make sure all of your images in your slideshow are the same dimensions. You can have variations of the same dimensions, and the CMS will fit that slide into the slideshow. However, what you'll end up having possibly is a different vertical dimension, and so as your slides, and I don't have a good example of that, but as your slides progress, if the slides themselves don't match and have the same dimensions, then your page will kind of jump up and down. So the most important thing is that all of your slides match each other in dimension. If you're starting off from scratch, you could use these image sizes as your go-to, and that would work. On our site, we also have the slideshow tags that you can use for the different types of slideshows. So I'm not really going to go into how to add a slideshow to your site, but we have the directions on our website there. Okay, so that's how you find out what dimension your canvas is. And your canvas it's a little bit confusing. Your canvas is different than your image size. So here on this image, we went to image, image size, and that showed us the actual dimensions of the picture itself. If we go to canvas size, this is showing us the outer pixel dimensions. And so it is possible here, I'll go ahead and do this. I could put in my pixel dimensions here and say 850 by 380. And so what it's going to do that it shows from here is it's going to crop directly into the center. So if I click OK, it's going to say this canvas is smaller, some clipping will occur, and so that's what's going to happen. Now I could still go to image, edit, transform, and I could scale that down to fit like I wanted on that canvas. But what I'm going to do instead is go back. I think maybe one of the easiest ways to get this to the size that you want for your slider is to use the crop tool. So with the crop tool, if I click there, if I just click on the crop tool and just try to crop my image, I can basically change it to be any kind of, dimension or whatever here. However, if instead up here, I can actually type in the dimensions that I want, and here it's already set as pixels per inch. So it kind of shows you width, height, resolution. So here's where I can say 850 by 380, and then my pixels are going to be 72. One thing that can possibly go wrong when you do this is it could default to inches, which then will try to make your photo like really huge. So just be careful. If it says inches, you can change it to px. The other thing you can do is right click here in the ruler and change all of your measurements to pixels. That will change this up here to just using pixels. And then because we are formatting for web, we could put in the web resolution here. I'm actually not going to. I'm just going to crop this so that it's the right kind of dimensions, and then when I save for web, that's going to change my resolution to web resolution. So here, the main point is that I just get the pixel dimensions right. So now I'll basically just, my crop box is constrained. It'll only let me crop to the image size that's like that. When I want to accept this, I could click on the check mark or just hit the enter key. And I'll click on the check mark. All right, so it's quite a bit smaller now, but it is the right dimensions for web. The final step now, and this is kind of important because now we're still working from that modified TIFF, so we want to just save a version for web. For those of you who've been using this, it looks a little bit different now. So if you actually go to File, you won't see the Save for Web anymore option. It's all under Export. So people who have been doing this for a while, they'll know the shortcut probably for Save for Web. Now there's a new shortcut for Export As. So I can go ahead and say Export As, and I'll have my options here. Now we will go through these formats. In this case, because it's a photograph, I'm going to choose a JPEG. And the other thing, because this is a slideshow graphic, and usually this takes me uploading one to remember, it has to be below 300 kilobytes. So here it says 426. In order to make that lesser, I can just lessen the quality here under the JPEG format, and I'm keeping my eye over here to make sure that I'm just getting right below that 300 cutoff. So here, this is going to lessen the quality a little bit, and it's going to compress it, by default. But here I can kind of control that, and then I'll say export all. Now here's where I would go, put it in my web folder. If I have time, I would do 850 by 380 so I can see that, and then click Save. So kind of the idea here, from what I can tell that Adobe is doing, instead of using Export, Save for Web, what you're able to do now is to have these export preferences. And so you can say, you know, I usually just export everything as a PNG, and then you can even have it put them in a specific file every time. And here, export files to an assets folder next to the current document. So you can have Photoshop create an assets folder for you and just automatically throw all of your web graphics in there. So with that idea, then you can, once you set up those preferences, you can use the quick export option, or you can always use that shortcut. We do have to talk a little bit about those formats before we move on to those advanced tips and tricks. There are different formats here. The formats have changed over the course of time. A lot of you are probably familiar with these formats. Right now, the standard ones, the go-to ones, are JPEG and then the PNG 24. I think there's also actually a PNG 32, which might be the default now in Photoshop. But you know, with GIF, really what you use for that is anything with an animated graphic. So those are still kind of trendy, and you create the animated graphics by using GIF. PNG 8 can be used for basic logos and that type of thing, but normally when you're using logos, things like that, use PNG 24. Now, you have to go out of your way to try to use PNG 8, so most people are usually either saving as a JPEG or a PNG 24 or 32. So here's the basics on this. If you just have a photograph and it doesn't have a lot of text or has minimal text, from what I've been told, and it could vary, you know, what everyone's been told, but the ideal format is JPEG. If you have a photograph that has text on it, logos, that type of thing, things where you need transparency, then the go-to is usually PNG. Now we'll talk about in a minute here this new file type that's called an SVG. That's a scalable vector graphic, and usually those are created in Illustrator, and they're actually vector, so they can be scaled, they can be transparent, and they can be a great option, like it says here, logos, buttons, icons, navigation elements. The one thing that you have to be careful of with your JPEGs, and the reason why you want to start with a high quality photo, is because every time you save for JPEG, you lose some pixels or some information within the image due to compression. So I just pulled this graphic off the internet. This is an extreme case, but you can see here how due to JPEG, just the normal compression, this doesn't necessarily have to do with resolution, but how we're saving it is causing this the pixels here to be summarized in a way where we actually lose some information. So questions there about file types and that type of thing, ways to save for the web? Okay, well, we'll move on, but if you do have questions, please submit them through the chat and we can take a break and answer those. So I do want to talk a little bit about that scalable vector format. I want to talk a little bit about smart objects, and then probably the coolest thing, Adobe Image Generator. So those scalable vector graphics, like I mentioned, they can be scaled without losing quality. Usually they're created in Illustrator, so I know this is a Photoshop basics for web, but I did want to talk about those. You can export those from Photoshop, and what that ends up looking like when you actually look at that SVG file, I have some here. When you actually look at the SVG file, it looks like a web document, and what it really looks like is a bunch of code. So it's actually building that graphic from within the browser itself. So maybe a lot of you are familiar with that, I'm not sure. So usually what you'll do is you'll have those elements in Illustrator or something like that, and then from here you'll go to File. You can either go to Export, or I believe Save for Web, you can do it from there too, and create individual vector graphics using that scalable vector format. I actually did that here. I did a few buttons, and if I was smart, I put the maybe in the modified. Nope, I didn't. Okay, so I wasn't doing a very good job there, but um, I actually did that on this sample page just to kind of show you the differences. So on the sample page, this top row of buttons is they're SVG files. The bottom row here, these are regular PNG files. And so really, you can't see a whole lot of difference here, but when you start to zoom in, if that's something that happens, you can start to see on these graphics, at least the edges start to become a little bit more blurry. And then especially as we zoom out, so something like that, you start to see, or you may start to see that the fonts don't appear as clear on the PNG. On this one, it's looking pretty similar here. So, but just like I just wanted to mention it. It is kind of a newer format. And like I said, it's usually created in Illustrator, but you can export things as SVG from Photoshop. And what those things would most likely be are smart objects. So a smart object is something that is a vector graphic within Photoshop. And usually how you end up getting smart objects in Photoshop is by, maybe on our slider graphic, for example, we want to have a trophy. So usually what you'll end up doing is you'll have that object in Illustrator, you'll just copy it, and then I think I have one here that I did. You'll paste it into Photoshop. Now when you paste, it'll give you the option paste as smart objects, pixels, paths, or shape layer. The smart object option is going to give you the most flexibility if you'd end up wanting to make changes to that graphic. So here if I say OK, it's going to place it, large on my screen. I can scale it down. So maybe I want to put it up here and scale that down. I can do that. A tip or trick here for scaling, if you hold down the shift key while you drag in and out that corner, it'll keep your object in proportion. That will work the same thing with your photographs. So once you have that smart object on your canvas and you've gotten it to where you like it, you have to hit enter, or if you try to move on, it'll ask you to accept your changes. And so down here in the bottom right, we see Vector Smart Object. Now the cool thing about this is if we decided that this yellow isn't standing out enough or something like that, we can double click on the icon by the Smart Object and it's going to open it up as its own Illustrator file. So this is separate from our original, and there we can make any changes that we need to make. So maybe I want this fill color and I want this whole thing, maybe I want the whole thing to be white. So no kind of shading or anything like that. So I just make my changes, I click save. When I go back to Photoshop, it is automatically updated. The other cool thing is I can still apply like transparencies and things like that because it's its own layer. I can make it, have different kind of looks here. And then also because it's a smart object, I can scale it up, I can scale it down, and I won't see that pixel and that pixelation that appears because it is a vector-based graphic. So it can be a really helpful thing to do, especially if you're mixing this kind of iconography in with your Photoshop document to keep those as smart objects. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about was something called Adobe Image Generator, and it looks like this was first rolled out in 2013. What Adobe Image Generator allows you to do is to create web graphics based off of your layers in Photoshop. The big thing about the generator, if you want to use it, it has to be turned on. By default, it's not available. So you'll find that under File, Generate, and then image assets. So file, generate, you should see a check by image assets when that's available. And so what it allows you to do is here in my layer name, I can click on this layer, and it is best practice to name your layers. I'm not always that good, but if you double click on that layer name, you can give it a layer. So I'm going to say Vibrant Campus. So what you can do is if you if you name your layer names with a file extension, and you can use .jpeg, you can use .png, you can use .gif. Basically, once you do that and hit enter, it's going to automatically create an assets folder for you, and it's going to put that picture in the assets folder. So let me make sure I know where this is being saved at. Okay. So here, this is in assets modified. Let me save this. Okay, so I had to click saved here. So once I did that, I called it modified slider, and then it creates a folder for me called modified slider assets. And then when I go in here, I can see the different assets that it automatically creates for me. So it created a JPEG file. It also created a file just with all the layers included. So I mean, the cool thing about this too is that if you could have one Photoshop file. You could name it, you know, slider 850 by 380 spring sliders like this one is. And you could give those names in the layers here, and then it could automatically just be creating your different web graphics for you. If you're doing web mockups or things like that, I could see that could be helpful. There's also a whole different there's a whole kind of naming scheme that you can do within the file names. So you can actually have it generate multiple copies here for you. So this layer I named Vibrant Campus JPEG. I also did one and I named it 50% space Vibrant Campus hyphen 50, and that created a scaled JPEG at half the size. In the follow-up, there's a great 15-minute tutorial just about the options by Adobe. I'll include that in case you want to check it out more. And then, like I mentioned, if I make changes here to this photo or do anything to it, it's going to update all my JPEGs for me. Cool. So that's the last tip or trick there, Adobe Image Generator. I'll include some of these shortcuts that we went over today in the follow-up. You'll have that also in the presentation slides. And as well as these helpful links, I'll also include a link to this Photoshop etiquette if you're interested to know more about, you know, the etiquette of using Photoshop, especially when you're working as part of a team. There's a great website with some kind of best practices. Unfortunately, we don't have a Photoshop training. We don't have a workshop at this time. If you want to learn more about Photoshop, we could potentially put together a class. I don't know exactly when a class will come out. And if you have specific projects you want to look at, we do offer desk side coaching, which are usually good if you have a specific goal in mind. We are in the process of scheduling sessions for spring 2017, so if you have any requests, anything like that, you can always reply back to the email I'll send out either later today or tomorrow and let us know what you'd like to see. All right, so I'll stick around for any questions. I will send out a follow-up once the recording is available with links to additional resources, and then I'll send out some answers to any questions I'm not able to answer in the chat. All right, thanks everyone for coming today.